Sarah Marshall walked into courtroom 302 on a crisp Monday morning, her brown leather briefcase held firmly in her right hand. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she made her way past the wooden barriers, her natural curls neatly pulled back in a professional bun. She wore a simple navy blue suit, not flashy, but well-tailored and appropriate for court. At 58 years old, Judge William Parker sat behind his imposing oak desk, barely looking up as he shuffled through the morning's cases. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an appearance of authority that he cultivated over 20 years on the bench. He'd seen thousands of cases, and in his mind, this was just another routine environmental violation. The courtroom was relatively empty that morning, with only a few spectators scattered across the wooden benches. Among them sat three members of the Oak Grove Housing Association, Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Reed, and Mr. Collins, all wearing self-satisfied expressions. They had filed the complaint against Sarah's community garden project, convinced they were protecting their precious neighborhood from what they saw as an environmental hazard. Case number 2347, Oak Grove Housing Association versus Sarah Marshall, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Sarah stepped forward confidently, standing at the defendant's table. She placed her briefcase on the table without making a sound, her movements deliberate and practiced, though few in the room noticed this detail. Judge Parker finally looked up, his eyes quickly scanning over Sarah. His gaze held that familiar look she'd seen countless times before, that split-second assessment, the subtle shift in expression that told her he'd already made assumptions about who she was and what she knew. "Ms. Marshall," Judge Parker began, emphasizing the Ms. with a slightly condescending tone, "you stand accused of violating Environmental Codes 15.7 and 23.4 in your—" He paused, checking his papers with an air of dismissal, "community garden project." The judge leaned back in his chair, looking down at Sarah over his glasses. "Do you understand the seriousness of these violations? We're talking about potential soil contamination in a residential area." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Judge Parker continued, his voice taking on the tone one might use when explaining something to a child. "These regulations exist for a reason, Ms. Marshall. We can't have people randomly deciding to dig up lots and plant whatever they please without proper permits and procedures." The members of the Housing Association nodded in agreement from their seats. Mr. Thompson, the association president, even allowed himself a small smirk. They had complained about Sarah's garden project from the day she'd started it 3 months ago, despite having no real understanding of what she was actually doing. "Your Honor, if I may," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. "Ms. Marshall," Judge Parker interrupted, holding up his hand. "I have reviewed the complaint filed by the Oak Grove Housing Association. They provided documentation showing that you began this project without proper environmental impact studies. They have photos of what they claim to be potentially hazardous materials being introduced to the soil." The judge picked up a photograph from his desk, studying it with exaggerated concern. "What exactly were you thinking, bringing in these materials to a residential area? Did you even consider the potential harm to the groundwater?" Sarah stood perfectly still, her expression neutral but attentive. She'd been in enough courtrooms to know the importance of timing. Around her, the morning sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Judge Parker set down the photograph and picked up his pen, already beginning to write. "Given the serious nature of these violations, I'm inclined to issue an immediate fine of $5,000 and order the immediate cessation of all gardening activities." He looked up at Sarah again, his expression a mixture of authority and patronizing concern. "Do you have anything to say in your defense before I make my ruling? And please, try to keep it brief. The court has a full docket today." The Housing Association members leaned forward in their seats, already savoring their victory. The court clerk prepared to record the judge's decision, her fingers poised over her keyboard. The morning silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the gentle hum of the heating system. Sarah took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to speak. The next few moments would completely transform the atmosphere in courtroom 302, though nobody except her knew it yet. The courtroom remained quiet as Mr. Thompson, the Housing Association president, rose from his seat. His expensive gray suit and red tie seemed chosen specifically to impress the court. He walked to the front with a thick folder tucked under his arm, his polished shoes clicking against the floor tiles. "Your Honor," Mr. Thompson began, his voice carrying an air of self-importance, "we have documented evidence of Ms. Marshall's blatant disregard for our community's environmental standards." He opened the folder and pulled out several photographs, handing them to the court clerk who passed them to Judge Parker. Judge Parker studied the first photograph with a frown. "Ms. Marshall, can you explain what these large containers of?" He squinted at the image. "Unknown substances are doing at your garden site." Sarah started to respond, but Mr. Thompson quickly interrupted. "If I may, Your Honor, our association has witnessed Ms. Marshall bringing these containers to the site multiple times over the past 3 months. We have serious concerns about contamination." Mrs. Reed, another association member, nodded vigorously from her seat. She was a small woman in her 60s who had appointed herself the neighborhood watchdog. "I personally saw her mixing these substances into the soil," she called out, despite not being asked to speak. Judge Parker tapped his gavel once. "Mrs. Reed, please wait to be called upon." He turned his attention back to the photographs, flipping through them with growing concern. These images show significant soil disturbance and what appears to be the introduction of foreign materials. Sarah stood calmly at her table, her hands folded in front of her. She watched as Mr. Thompson pulled out more documents from his folder, spreading them across the prosecution's table with theatrical flourish. "We've also documented unusual plant growth patterns in neighboring yards," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice growing more confident. "We believe Ms. Marshall's activities are affecting the entire neighborhood's ecosystem. Just last week, Mrs. Peterson's prize roses started showing strange spots on their leaves." A few gasps came from the spectators' seats. Judge Parker's frown deepened as he looked at Sarah. "Ms. Marshall, are you aware that interfering with the local ecosystem can have far-reaching consequences?" "Your Honor, if you would allow me to," Sarah began, but was cut off again. "We have a petition signed by 15 residents," Mr. Thompson announced, pulling out another document with a flourish. "All of them are concerned about the environmental impact of Ms. Marshall's so-called garden project." He emphasized the last 2 words with air quotes. Judge Parker accepted the petition, scanning the signatures. "Ms. Marshall, this is a serious matter. Your neighbors are clearly worried about their safety and property values." The morning sun had risen higher now, casting stark shadows across the courtroom. Sarah remained standing, her posture perfect, her expression unchanged. She watched as Mr. Thompson continued his presentation, pulling out more photographs and documents. "Here's a soil sample analysis we had done," Mr. Thompson said, sliding another paper toward the judge. "While we couldn't identify all the substances present, our expert noted several unusual chemical signatures." "And who performed this analysis?" Judge Parker asked, adjusting his glasses. Well," Mr. Thompson hesitated for the first time. "It was done by my nephew. He's studying chemistry at the community college." Judge Parker raised an eyebrow but continued reviewing the document. The court clerk typed quietly in the background, recording every word of the proceedings. "Your Honor," Mr. Thompson concluded, straightening his tie, "we believe Ms. Marshall's actions represent a clear and present danger to our community. We're asking for immediate cessation of all her activities and substantial fines to deter such behavior in the future." Sarah's hand moved slowly to her briefcase, unclasping it without making a sound. The housing association members watched her with suspicious eyes, probably expecting her to pull out some amateur gardening magazine in her defense. Judge Parker set down the last photograph and looked directly at Sarah. "Well, Ms. Marshall, the evidence seems quite damaging. What do you have to say about these accusations? And please," he added with a slight wave of his hand. Sarah pulled out a thick folder from her briefcase, its edges neatly labeled with colored tabs. The sound of papers rustling filled the courtroom as she organized her documents with practiced precision. Everyone watched, waiting for what they assumed would be a fumbling defense. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice clear and professional, "I am Dr. Sarah Marshall, lead environmental lawyer at the Goldman Environmental Foundation." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I also hold a Ph.D. in environmental science from Yale University, with a specialization in soil remediation and urban ecosystem restoration." The change in the courtroom was instant and dramatic. Judge Parker's hand, which had been reaching for his gavel, froze midair. Mr. Thompson's smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of confusion. Mrs. Reed, who had been whispering to another association member, suddenly sat up straight, her mouth forming a perfect O. "I'm sorry," Judge Parker said, removing his glasses and wiping them with a cloth, a nervous habit he'd developed over years on the bench. "Did you say Goldman Environmental Foundation?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, pulling out her credentials. "I've been their lead environmental lawyer for the past 15 years. Before that, I spent 8 years working with the Environmental Protection Agency on urban soil restoration projects." The court clerk handed Sarah's credentials to Judge Parker, who studied them with increasingly wide eyes. His earlier condescending expression had been replaced by one of growing discomfort. "The substances Mr. Thompson referred to," Sarah continued, pulling out several laboratory reports, "are actually specialized organic soil amendments, each carefully tested and approved by both the EPA and state environmental agencies." She handed the reports to the clerk. "These reports detail their composition and environmental impact assessments." Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His nephew's community college analysis suddenly seemed far less impressive. "Furthermore," Sarah said, extracting more documents, "the unusual plant growth patterns Mr. Thompson mentioned are actually signs of successful soil restoration. Those spots on Mrs. Peterson's roses, they're thriving because of increased beneficial soil bacteria in the area, as confirmed by these soil health reports from the State Agricultural Laboratory." Judge Parker was now leaning forward, genuinely interested. The morning sun highlighted the beads of sweat forming on Mr. Thompson's forehead. "Your Honor, my community garden project isn't just a hobby," Sarah explained, her voice gaining warmth. "It's part of a larger urban restoration initiative that I've been leading across 5 states. We're using cutting-edge bioremediation techniques to improve soil quality in urban areas affected by decades of pollution." She pulled out a series of before and after soil analysis reports, each bearing the official seals of various environmental agencies. "These tests show a 60% improvement in soil quality since we began the project. The foreign materials Mr. Thompson mentioned are actually beneficial fungi and bacteria that naturally clean and restore soil health." The housing association members were now shrinking in their seats. Mrs. Reed had stopped taking notes and was staring at her shoes. "As for permits," Sarah continued, pulling out another stack of documents, "here are copies of all necessary approvals from the city, state, and federal environmental protection agencies. You'll notice they're all properly filed and dated 2 months before the project began." Judge Parker examined the permits, his face growing increasingly red. He looked at the housing association members, then back at Sarah, then down at his own earlier notes where he'd been preparing to issue a fine. "Dr. Marshall," he said, emphasizing her proper title this time, "I see that your documentation is extremely thorough." He cleared. Sarah walked to the center of the courtroom, carrying a large laminated chart that she carefully unfolded. The chart showed detailed soil analysis graphs and colorful diagrams of the garden's restoration process. Even from their seats, everyone could see the professional quality of the presentation. "Your Honor," Sarah began, pointing to the first graph, "these charts show the soil contamination levels in our neighborhood over the past 20 years. Her finger traced a red line that peaked dangerously high. "This is what happens when industrial waste seeps into residential areas without proper remediation." Judge Parker leaned forward, genuinely interested now. The reading glasses he'd used earlier to look down at Sarah were now perched properly on his nose as he studied the scientific data before him. The housing association wasn't entirely wrong to be concerned about environmental issues, Sarah continued diplomatically. However, they misidentified the real problem. She turned to face Mr. Thompson and his colleagues. "The strange substances you've been photographing are actually helping to clean up decades of hidden contamination in our soil." Mr. Thompson's face turned a shade paler. "Hidden contamination? In our neighborhood?" "Yes," Sarah replied, pulling out another chart. "Your property, Mr. Thompson, sits on what was once a small industrial cleaning facility in the 1960s. The chemicals from that facility have been slowly spreading through the groundwater for decades." Mrs. Reed gasped audibly from her seat. Several other association members started whispering among themselves, That earlier confidence completely evaporated. Judge Parker removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. Dr. Marshall, are you saying that your garden project is actually a professional environmental remediation effort? Exactly, Your Honor. Sarah responded, pulling out a thick environmental impact study. The Goldman Environmental Foundation identified this neighborhood as a priority site for our urban restoration project. We chose to use a community garden format because it allows us to clean the soil while providing a beautiful, functional space for residents. She walked over to her briefcase and retrieved a series of photographs, professional ones, unlike the amateur shots the Housing Association had provided. These showed the gradual transformation of the garden site, complete with scientific equipment and professional environmental technicians at work. These images show our weekly soil testing process, Sarah explained. Each plant in the garden has been specifically chosen for its ability to absorb and neutralize certain contaminants. It's a process called phytoremediation. She paused, then added with a gentle smile, "That's why Mrs. Peterson's roses are doing so well. They're finally growing in properly clean soil." The judge was now completely engrossed in the documentation. He picked up one of the soil analysis reports, comparing it to the Housing Association's amateur study. The difference in quality and professionalism was startling. "Dr. Marshall," he said, his tone completely different from earlier, "this is remarkable work. Why didn't the Foundation inform the Housing Association about the project's full scope?" Sarah pulled out one final document, a copy of a certified letter. "We did, Your Honor. 3 months ago, we sent detailed information packets to every household in the neighborhood, including all Housing Association members." She handed the letter to the clerk. "We also held 2 community meetings to explain the project. Unfortunately, no one from the Housing Association attended." Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, remembering the unopened envelope still sitting on his desk at home. Mrs. Reed suddenly became very interested in her phone, likely remembering the meeting invitation she'd dismissed as unimportant. "I see," Judge Parker said slowly, looking at the Housing Association members with disappointment. "So this entire complaint was filed without properly reviewing the information that was provided to you." The courtroom fell silent. The morning sun now streamed fully through the windows, illuminating the detailed scientific documents spread across the judge's bench. Documents that told a story very different from what everyone had assumed at the start of the hearing. Sarah stood quietly, her years of experience evident in her calm demeanor. She knew she didn't need to say anything more. The facts spoke for themselves, and the truth about her garden project was finally clear to everyone in the courtroom. The case was about to take yet another turn, one that would have lasting implications for the entire community. The courtroom door opened quietly as several community members entered, taking seats in the back rows. Among them was Ms. Rodriguez, a local high school science teacher, who raised her hand politely to get the judge's attention. "Your Honor," Ms. Rodriguez said when acknowledged, "may I speak about Dr. Marshall's garden project?" Judge Parker looked at Sarah, who nodded her agreement. "You may proceed," he said, his tone now carrying genuine interest rather than the dismissiveness from earlier. Ms. Rodriguez stood, smoothing her skirt as she moved to the front. "I bring my environmental science students to Dr. Marshall's garden twice a week. What she's created isn't just cleaning our soil, it's teaching our children about environmental responsibility." From another row, Mr. Chen, an elderly resident, slowly rose to his feet. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, he said, his voice slightly shaky but clear. "My wife died of cancer 5 years ago. 3 others on our street also had cancer. We never knew why until Dr. Marshall's soil tests revealed the contamination from the old factory." The Housing Association members looked at each other uncomfortably. Mr. Thompson loosened his tie, which suddenly felt too tight. "The truth is," Sarah had explained gently, "this project wasn't just about creating a garden. We needed to address the environmental hazards without causing panic in the community." She pulled out a map showing cancer clusters in the neighborhood over the past decades. "The Housing Association's complaint actually helped us bring this information into the open." Judge Parker studied the cancer cluster map, his expression growing more serious. "Dr. Marshall, are you saying the Housing Association's interference could have delayed crucial environmental cleanup efforts?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied. "But more importantly, their complaint gives us an opportunity to educate the entire community about what's really happening in their soil." Mrs. Reed, who had been quiet for some time, suddenly stood up. Her face showed genuine concern rather than her earlier superiority. "Dr. Marshall, my grandchildren play in my backyard every weekend. Are they in danger?" Sarah's expression softened. "That's exactly why we started this project, Mrs. Reed. The garden isn't just beautifying the neighborhood. It's part of a systematic effort to make your grandchildren's playground safe." More community members began sharing their stories. A young mother talked about how her children learned about ecosystem restoration by helping in the garden. A retired botanist described how he'd noticed the improvement in his own garden's soil quality since the project began. Mr. Thompson, watching his case crumble, made one last attempt to save face. "But why weren't we consulted about this project before it began?" Sarah walked to her briefcase and pulled out a stack of meeting minutes. "Actually, Mr. Thompson, we have records of attempting to contact you 7 times. We sent letters, emails, and even came to your house twice." She handed the documentation to the clerk. "Each time, we were told you were too busy to discuss a simple garden project." The Housing Association president's face reddened as he remembered brushing off what he'd assumed were unimportant interruptions to his day. Judge Parker reviewed the meeting minutes, shaking his head slowly. "It appears, Mr. Thompson, that your association's assumptions about Dr. Marshall and her project have led to some serious oversights." Ms. Rodriguez raised her hand again. "Your Honor, my students have been documenting the soil improvement in their science journals. Would you like to see their data? It confirms everything Dr. Marshall has presented." The judge nodded, and the science teacher motioned to several students who had entered the courtroom. They came forward with their carefully maintained research notebooks, filled with graphs, observations, and weekly soil test results. As the students' data was being reviewed, Sarah noticed something remarkable happening in the courtroom. The invisible barriers that had divided the community were beginning to crumble. Housing association members were talking quietly with other residents, looking at the students' notebooks with interest rather than suspicion. The morning's hearing had exposed more than just soil contamination. It had revealed the deeper prejudices and assumptions that had prevented the community from working together to solve a serious environmental problem. As Sarah watched the scene unfold, she knew that the real work of healing, both the soil and the community, was just beginning. Judge Parker sat quietly in his chambers during the court's lunch recess, staring at the wall of legal certificates that had always filled him with pride. Now, they seemed to mock him. The morning's events played over and over in his mind as he confronted his own biased behavior. He picked up Dr. Marshall's credentials again, reading them for the 3rd time. Yale University FAGE, Environmental Protection Agency experience, lead attorney at a prestigious foundation, all the qualifications he had dismissed with a single glance when she walked into his courtroom. A knock on his chamber door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, quickly straightening his robes. His clerk, Jessica, entered with another stack of documents. "Your Honor, I found something you should see." She placed a legal journal on his desk, open to an article featuring Dr. Sarah Marshall's groundbreaking work in environmental law. She's apparently won 3 major Supreme Court cases on environmental protection. Judge Parker removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "How did we miss this in the case preparation, Jessica?" "We didn't miss it, sir," Jessica replied carefully. "It was all in the case file. You just didn't read past the first page this morning." The truth of her words stung. He'd taken one look at Sarah Marshall and made assumptions that had colored his entire approach to the case. 30 years on the bench, and he'd fallen into the very trap he warned young judges about. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session was about to begin. The seats were now full, word having spread through the neighborhood about the morning's revelations. Local news reporters had even shown up, sensing an important story developing. Judge Parker entered, his usual confident stride slightly hesitant. Everyone rose. The atmosphere was different now. The morning's hierarchy had been completely upended. "Please be seated," he said, adjusting his microphone. "Before we continue, I have something to say." He looked directly at Sarah, who sat calmly at her table. "Dr. Marshall, this court owes you an apology." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judges rarely admitted mistakes, especially so openly. "This morning, I made assumptions about your knowledge and qualifications without reviewing the facts. I allowed my preconceptions to influence how I conducted this hearing." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. It was unprofessional and unworthy of this court. Sarah nodded graciously, maintaining her professional composure. Furthermore, Judge Parker continued, I've spent the lunch recess reviewing your complete case file. Your work in environmental law is, well, frankly, I should have been honored to have you in my courtroom rather than treating you with condescension. Mr. Thompson and the Housing Association members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They weren't the only ones who had misjudged Dr. Marshall. In light of this, the judge announced, I'm not only dismissing all charges against Dr. Marshall's project, but I'm also ordering an official review of how environmental cases are handled in this court. He turned to address the Housing Association directly. Mr. Thompson, while your concern for the community is admirable, your association's actions could have seriously delayed crucial environmental cleanup efforts. I strongly suggest you work with Dr. Marshall rather than against her. Mr. Thompson nodded, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. Yes, Your Honor. We understand now. Judge Parker looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with as many people as he could. Let this case serve as a reminder to all of us. Justice isn't about making assumptions or rushing to judgments. It's about careful consideration of facts and respect for expertise, regardless of how that expertise presents itself. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the high windows, highlighting the changed expressions on everyone's faces. The same room that had witnessed prejudice and dismissal in the morning was now filled with reflection and understanding. Sarah gathered her documents quietly, knowing that this moment was about more than just her garden project. It was about challenging assumptions, about looking beyond appearances, about the importance of keeping an open mind. Judge Parker watched her, realizing that today's case would likely become a turning point in his career, a reminder that even after decades on the bench, there were still crucial lessons to be learned about justice, fairness, and the danger of first impressions. Judge Parker stood at the bench one final time that day, preparing to deliver his official ruling. The courtroom remained packed, with even more community members having arrived to witness the conclusion of this unexpected case. Having reviewed all the evidence, Judge Parker began, his voice carrying a new tone of humility. This court finds the following. He cleared his throat and lifted the first page of his decision. First, all charges against Dr. Sarah Marshall and her environmental restoration project are hereby dismissed. He paused, looking directly at the Housing Association members. Furthermore, the Oak Grove Housing Association is ordered to issue a formal written apology to Dr. Marshall for their unfounded accusations. Mr. Thompson nodded solemnly, already pulling out his notebook to start drafting the apology. Mrs. Reed dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the reality of her earlier behavior finally sinking in. Secondly, the judge continued, this court formally recognizes the vital importance of Dr. Marshall's environmental project. The Goldman Environmental Foundation's work in our community is not just permitted to continue, it is to be actively supported. Sarah sat quietly, maintaining her professional demeanor even as several community members behind her smiled and nodded in approval. Third, Judge Parker said, straightening his papers, I am establishing a new Community Environmental Advisory Board. He looked around the courtroom. This board will include Dr. Marshall, representatives from the Housing Association, local science educators, and community members. Their purpose will be to oversee and support environmental initiatives in our district. Ms. Rodriguez, the science teacher, quickly raised her hand. Your Honor, would it be possible to include student representatives on this board? My environmental science students have already been documenting the project's progress. The judge smiled, his first genuine smile of the day. An excellent suggestion. Yes, 2 student representatives will be included. He then turned to address Mr. Thompson and the Housing Association directly. Rather than filing complaints, your organization's resources would be better spent supporting this crucial environmental work. I suggest you start by actually reading the information packets Dr. Marshall provided months ago. Several people in the courtroom chuckled softly, but the laughter held no malice. The morning's tension had been replaced by a sense of shared purpose and understanding. Finally, Judge Parker said, his voice becoming more personal, I want to address something beyond the specifics of this case. He removed his glasses, looking directly at the assembled crowd. Today has been a powerful reminder that justice requires us to look past our initial assumptions. My own behavior this morning demonstrated how easily prejudice can cloud judgment, even in a court of law. The courtroom fell silent, everyone understanding the significance of a judge acknowledging his own bias. Therefore, he continued, I am implementing mandatory bias training for all court officers in this district. We must do better. He turned to Sarah. Dr. Marshall, would your foundation be willing to assist in developing environmental law training for our judicial staff as well? Sarah stood, smoothing her suit jacket. The Goldman Environmental Foundation would be honored to help, Your Honor. In fact, we have an existing program that could be adapted for judicial education. Judge Parker nodded appreciatively. Excellent. We'll begin next month. He picked up his gavel, then paused. One last thing. Dr. Marshall, would you be willing to give a presentation to the court staff about your restoration project? I believe we all could learn a great deal from your expertise. Of course, Your Honor. Sarah replied with a warm smile. Education has always been a key part of our mission. The judge raised his gavel. Then this case is dismissed. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, but instead of marking an ending, it felt more like a beginning. As people began to stand and gather their things, there was a noticeable shift in how they interacted. Housing association members who had arrived that morning ready for battle were now exchanging contact information with their neighbors. Students were eagerly showing their research notebooks to interested adults. The invisible barriers that had divided the community were continuing to dissolve. Sarah packed her briefcase, watching as Judge Parker stepped down from the bench. The morning's confrontation had transformed into an opportunity for positive change, not just for the environment, but for the entire community. Sometimes, she thought, the most important victories happened after the case was officially closed. 6 months after the memorable court hearing, the community garden had transformed into something far more significant than anyone had imagined. On a bright Saturday morning, Sarah stood at the entrance of what was now called the Oak Grove Environmental Education Center, watching as dozens of people gathered for its official opening ceremony. The once contested garden plots now flourished with both plants and purpose. Students from Ms. Rodriguez's environmental science class led tour groups, proudly explaining the soil remediation process to visitors. They wore green T-shirts with environmental leaders printed on the back, a program that had grown from the 2 student representatives on the advisory board to include 30 dedicated young environmentalists. Mr. Thompson, who had arrived early to help set up chairs, looked nothing like the antagonistic Housing Association president from 6 months ago. He now served as the community outreach coordinator for the project, using his organizational skills to bring neighbors together rather than divide them. Dr. Marshall, he called out, hurrying over with a clipboard, the news crews are here, and Judge Parker just arrived. Should we begin the ceremony? Sarah nodded, smiling at how much things had changed. The same local news stations that had come to cover the controversy were now here to document a success story. Their previous headlines about community conflict had evolved into a model environmental partnership. Judge Parker, who had become a regular visitor to the garden, stood chatting with Mrs. Reed. The former Housing Association watchdog had surprised everyone by becoming one of the project's most enthusiastic supporters. She now ran a weekend program teaching children about organic gardening and environmental responsibility. If I could have everyone's attention, Sarah called out, stepping up to the small podium they had set up near the garden's entrance. The crowd quieted, gathering around to listen. 6 months ago, I stood in a courtroom, defending this project against those who misunderstood its purpose, she began. Today, I stand here with those same people who have become some of our most valuable partners in environmental restoration. The audience applauded as Sarah gestured to the transformed space around them. Where there had once been contaminated soil, native plants now thrived. The garden had expanded to include an outdoor classroom, testing stations, and educational displays explaining the soil remediation process. Judge Parker took the podium next. What began as a case of misunderstanding has become a model for community cooperation, he said. Our court's new environmental training program, developed with Dr. Marshall's help, is now being adopted by other districts across the state. Ms. Rodriguez's students then presented their research findings, showing graphs that documented the steady improvement in soil quality. Their once simple science journals had evolved into sophisticated environmental monitoring reports that even professional scientists praised. Mr. Chen, The elderly resident who had lost his wife to cancer stood up to speak. "This garden isn't just cleaning our soil," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's making sure no other families have to suffer like mine did. That's worth more than any property value." As the ceremony continued, Sarah noticed something remarkable about the crowd. There were no more divisions between housing association members and garden supporters. They were simply neighbors working together to make their community healthier and safer. The local university had even established a scholarship program inspired by the project's success. Two of Ms. Rodriguez's students had already received full rides to study environmental science, planning to return and continue the work that had changed their community. As the ceremony drew to a close, Sarah watched Judge Parker talking with a group of visiting judges from other districts. His experience had inspired a broader conversation about bias in environmental cases, leading to changes that went far beyond their small community. "Dr. Marshall," a young student called out, running up with a soil testing kit, "we just got the latest results. The contamination levels are down another 15% from last month." Sarah smiled, remembering how the same spot had been the source of so much controversy half a year ago. Now it was a place of learning, healing, and community pride. The garden had done more than clean the soil. It had shown how prejudice and misunderstanding could be transformed into partnership and progress. As people mingled and celebrated, Sarah knew that the true success wasn't just in the improved soil readings or the educational programs. It was in the changed hearts and minds of everyone involved, proving that sometimes the best way to overcome prejudice was to get your hands dirty together in the garden of understanding.